The first time the file appeared on my desk, I assumed it was some kind of prank, an unmarked envelope, no return address, only a single sheet inside. But the moment I unfolded it, a cold, sour feeling slid down my spine. It was a family tree, crudely drawn in pencil, the names scratched so violently they tore through the paper. All but one. At the very bottom, the last surviving branch, "Find us." The handwriting trembled, as if the writer was either terrified or barely strong enough to hold the pencil. I didn't want to get involved. No sane person would. But something about the jagged lines and the frantic scribbles around the edges pulled me in, the way someone might stare too long at a scene they wish they hadn't witnessed. The more I looked, the more I realized the pattern was wrong. The branches looped back on themselves, circling through generations like something feeding on its own tail. Whatever this family was, they hadn't grown outward. They had folded inward. By the second day, I discovered the name of a property tucked away in a forgotten corner of Appalachia, a place locals pretended didn't exist. When I called the nearest sheriff's office, the line fell silent the moment I mentioned the surname. A slow exhale, then a click. No explanation. No warning. Just an unspoken message, stay away. But fear has a strange way of drawing you closer, especially when you don't yet understand what you should be afraid of. When I arrived in town, people watched me the way you watch someone walking toward a house that everyone knows is haunted. A gas station attendant, pale as candle wax, whispered that the family had been different, that they kept to themselves, that the father believed no blood was pure except his own. The attendant's eyes darted to the tree line as he spoke, as though he expected something to step out of the shadows and listen. I wanted to leave then. Truly, I did. But a story like this doesn't let you walk away once you've seen its first layer. And so I drove to the property, a collapsing farmhouse swallowed by overgrown brush and silence thick enough to choke on. The windows were shattered, the front door hanging crooked as if it had been forced open years ago and never shut again. Inside, the air felt wrong, stale with the kind of stillness that suggests nothing has lived there for a very long time, yet something hasn't quite died either. On the far wall, carved into the wood with desperate, tearing strokes, was a message that froze me in place. It was the same handwriting from the tree. The same trembling letters. And it said only one thing: he is not finished. Key point number 1 describes the moment the journalist receives the anonymous file, and expanding it into a longer narrative reveals how deeply unsettling that moment truly is. It begins in an ordinary newsroom on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, the kind where stories feel predictable and the world seems unwilling to surprise anyone. The journalist is sorting through a routine stack of assignments when the envelope appears on his desk without explanation. It has no postmark, no return address, no delivery signature, nothing to indicate how it arrived or who brought it. Its paper is slightly damp, as though it had been handled by someone with clammy hands or exposed to the elements on its way. The weight of it is light, too light to contain anything of substance, and yet in that moment, it feels heavier than anything he has touched in weeks. Curiosity overpowers caution, and he tears the seal open. Inside is a single piece of paper, folded twice with an almost obsessive precision. When he unfolds it, he finds a hand-drawn family tree. The structure is strange from the beginning. Instead of branching outward into generations the way any normal lineage would, the lines twist inward, looping and reconnecting like tangled roots of a tree trying to grow in on itself. The names are messy and uneven, as though the writer was shaking while trying to inscribe them, and many of them are crossed out with such violent pressure that the pencil ripped straight through the page. But what chills him most is not the scratches or the erratic handwriting. Near the bottom of the paper, surrounded by faint smudges that look almost like fingerprints, one name remains untouched. Someone has circled it, and beneath it, in thin, wavering letters, is a message that feels less like a note and more like a plea. Asterisk, the truth rots underground. Asterisk, the words carry the unmistakable tension of someone who wrote in fear, someone who didn't expect to be alive long enough to see anyone else read it. He tries to convince himself it's a hoax, the kind of urban legend bait someone drops off at a newsroom hoping to stir up attention. But as he traces the loops and circles of the tree with his eyes, he notices something unsettling. The dates align too neatly to be random. The surnames match a handful of faint memories, a case he once heard a retired detective mention, a rumor whispered at a bar during a crime convention years ago, a brief reference in an old newspaper he once archived. He realizes then that the diagram is not the work of an imaginative prankster. It is a map of something real, something buried, something someone risked their safety to reveal. And as he stares at it, a slow dread settles in, the kind that tells him this single sheet of paper is about to pull him into a story he may never fully escape. Key point number 2 deepens the mystery by guiding the journalist from the safety of his newsroom toward the first physical trace of the family's existence, the abandoned property whispered about in local circles but never openly discussed. After studying the strange family tree for hours, he begins searching public records, old case files, and scattered mentions in outdated news clippings. The information is sparse, almost deliberately erased, but one detail keeps resurfacing: a remote rural property tied to the same last name scratched across the bottom of the family tree. Its location is vague, marked only by a county reference and a long-defunct road number that no longer appears on modern maps, as though time itself tried to bury it. When he makes his first call to verify the address, the county clerk pauses for an uncomfortably long moment before responding in a tone that's both monotone and strained, as if choosing each word carefully. She confirms the property existed but notes it was condemned decades ago, right after a sudden police raid that yielded no public report. When the journalist asks what the raid involved, the clerk abruptly claims the rest of the files are sealed and changes the subject. Her fear is nearly palpable through the phone, leaving him with the uneasy sense that this property is more than a footnote, it is a wound the town has tried for years to keep covered. Unable to shake the feeling that this address is the key to understanding the meaning behind the family tree, he digs deeper. He discovers a handful of older residents in online forums who vaguely remember the property, referring to it only as that place we don't talk about. Their comments are cryptic, mentions of strange noises at night, unusual lights in the woods, and a family that seemed to exist apart from the rest of the world even when they lived only a few miles from town. The journalist tries contacting several locals directly, but every voicemail he leaves is ignored, and the few who pick up the phone hang up the moment he says the family name. Still, the silence tells him something. People don't avoid topics without reason. Fear doesn't linger for decades unless something unforgettable once happened. The abandoned property becomes more than a location, it becomes a presence, one that seems to breathe just beneath the surface of everything he uncovers. It feels as though the land itself is holding its secrets tight, waiting for someone foolish or desperate enough to disturb them. As he traces the route on a map, the roads narrowing into rural isolation, he realizes that the family tree didn't point him there by accident. It was an invitation from someone who wanted the truth uncovered, and a warning from everyone else who wished it had stayed buried. Key point number 3 centers on the discovery of sealed court records, and expanding it reveals how the journalist's investigation shifts from unsettling curiosity to something far darker. After confirming that the abandoned property once belonged to the same family mentioned in the mysterious file, he turns to legal archives, hoping to find concrete documentation, anything that might explain why official information seems to have been swallowed by silence. What he finds instead is a wall of sealed records, each more restricted than the last. It begins with a routine search in the county database, a task he expects to take minutes. But when he enters the family's surname, the system flags the entries with a security code he has never seen before, a designation typically used only for cases involving severe trauma, minors, or matters considered too sensitive for public release. Intrigued and frustrated, the journalist visits the courthouse in person, a building with aging files and clerks who have worked there long enough to remember long-buried stories. One elderly clerk, startled by the mention of the family, stiffens as if the air around her has suddenly dropped in temperature. She warns him that the files he's searching for are sealed for good reason and that prying into them would be unkind to those who lived through it. Her eyes soften with something between pity and fear, suggesting she knows more than she is willing or allowed to say. When he presses gently, she lowers her voice and admits that the case involved multiple disappearances that were never publicly explained, incidents that seemed to stretch back generations but were never fully documented. Determined to uncover what the authorities tried so hard to lock away, he files a formal request for access, knowing it will almost certainly be denied. Hours later, as expected, he receives a rejection notice, but there's something unusual about it. Instead of citing standard confidentiality laws, The rejection references a special order issued decades earlier, one that prohibits the release of any information pertaining to members of the household, their descendants, or any evidence collected on or near the estate. The phrasing is eerily broad, as though whoever wrote it wanted to ensure nothing, no testimony, no photograph, no name, could ever escape into the public record. This discovery shakes the journalist more than he wants to admit. Legal systems don't bury cases without a trace unless what they contain is too disturbing, too damaging, or too inexplicable for public understanding. Combined with what he has already seen, the frantic handwriting on the family tree, the erased property records, the cold avoidance from locals, the sealed files confirm that the story is not just tragic or unusual. It is something systematically hidden. This realization fills him with equal parts dread and determination. Whatever happened in that family was not just wrong, it was something authorities hoped would never see daylight again, and now he has no choice but to uncover why. Key point number 4 reveals how the journalist begins encountering direct human resistance, a wall of fear built not from secrecy alone but from lived experience, and expanding it brings out the suffocating tension between him and the townspeople. After days of tracking down scraps of information, he realizes he can no longer rely solely on records and archives. He needs people who remember. He begins visiting the rural towns surrounding the abandoned property, hoping someone will be willing to talk, even briefly. But from the moment he arrives, the air feels different, thick, hesitant, as though the town is collectively holding its breath. The first few locals he approaches respond with polite distance, their eyes sliding away the moment he mentions the family name. They say they don't remember, even though the tremor in their voices reveals they do. Others simply shake their heads and walk away, offering nothing but silence. He enters a small diner on the edge of town, thinking shared meals might lower defenses. The chatter in the room quiets the instant he steps inside. He tries speaking with a middle-aged man at the counter, a local who looks like he has lived there his entire life, but the man stiffens when he explains what he is investigating. Without making eye contact, the man mutters a warning that people who dig too deeply into the past tend to find more than they're prepared for. Before the journalist can ask what that means, the man stands up and leaves cash on the counter as if fleeing contamination. The waitress, who has barely acknowledged him, leans in just long enough to whisper that outsiders who looked into that family didn't always return, and those who did were different afterward, quiet, unpredictable, broken in ways they never were before. Each failed attempt adds weight to the sense that the town is hiding from something that once lived too close. It becomes clear the fear is not rooted in rumor or superstition but in memory, something witnessed firsthand. These people are not protecting the family, they are protecting themselves. At one point, a retired sheriff's deputy listens to the journalist's questions with an expression carved from stone. When asked directly about the old raid on the property, the deputy's jaw tightens. He says only that some events are too infectious to revisit, then warns him, firmly, to leave the story alone. Despite the wall of silence, the reactions themselves become clues. Fear this deep does not survive decades unless the trauma behind it was extraordinary. Every averted gaze, every abruptly ended conversation, every whispered warning paints the same picture. The family was not merely troubled or isolated. They were something people prayed they would never encounter again. And the journalist, realizing the locals' terror is genuine, begins to sense that whatever waits on that abandoned property may be far worse than anything he has yet imagined. Key point number 5 marks a critical shift in the investigation, because for the first time the journalist encounters someone directly tied to the family's past, someone who lived through the horror instead of merely whispering about it. After days of being stonewalled by locals, he grows increasingly frustrated and begins digging through relocation records, name changes, and archived welfare documents. It's a tedious, exhausting process, but eventually one detail stands out: a woman whose identity was legally changed in the late 1980s under emergency protective circumstances, with the originating county matching the location of the abandoned property. Her new name is buried beneath layers of sealed forms, but through cross-referencing small clerical errors, old signatures, and a nearly lost hospital intake form, he tracks her down to a distant city where she has lived quietly for decades. When he finally knocks on her door, he's greeted by a woman who looks much older than her age, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding shadows. She hesitates before letting him in, studying him with a wary expression, perhaps trying to decide whether he is naive, reckless, or truly determined. After a long silence, she steps aside and allows him into a small, sparsely furnished apartment, the kind of place chosen by someone who values invisibility. The atmosphere inside is tense, as though the walls hold memories she spent years trying to forget. She listens without interrupting as he explains what is uncovered: the file on his desk, the abandoned property, the sealed court records, the terrified locals. When he mentions the family tree with the frantic handwriting and the plea for truth, something shifts in her expression, a flicker of pain, recognition, and dread. Her hands tremble slightly as she sits down, and for a long time she doesn't speak. When she finally does, her voice is quiet, almost fragile, as though each word costs her something. She doesn't tell him everything. Trauma has carved deep boundaries inside her. But she confirms one thing, that she was once part of that family, raised under the control of a man whose belief in preserving purity twisted the entire household into something monstrous. She describes him not as violent in the traditional sense, but as a manipulator who used fear, isolation, and psychological bondage as tools. She says he convinced his daughter, her mother, that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, that only their bloodline was safe, that love and duty were obligations owed to him. The result was a cycle that trapped every child born on that property, each one raised to obey, to hide, and to fear defiance. When the journalist presses for details, she stops him. Some truths, she says, are too heavy for a single conversation, too painful to speak in full. But before he leaves, she gives him one final warning: whatever he thinks he knows about the family is only a fraction of the truth, and the father's influence did not die when the house was abandoned. She tells him the children grew up believing the world outside was their enemy, and that at least some of them survived. Then, with an expression filled with sorrow and terror, she tells him he should walk away while he still can, because the family's story is not finished and the bloodline was never meant to escape the property where it began. Key point number 6 captures the journalist's first physical encounter with the abandoned homestead, the place that has lived only in whispers until now, and expanding it reveals how the boundary between rumor and reality begins to dissolve. After speaking with the surviving woman, he feels a mixture of dread and responsibility, knowing that her warning should have been enough to send him home, yet also sensing that the truth is now too close to ignore. Armed with coordinates pieced together from old maps and property records, he drives toward the location she begged him to avoid. The road narrows as he travels deeper into rural isolation, the pavement giving way to gravel, then dirt, until it becomes little more than a path carved through suffocating forest. The closer he gets, the heavier the air feels, as though the forest itself is reacting to his presence. Sunlight filters through the trees in thin, weak strands, and the quiet around him seems unnaturally complete. No insects, no birds, not even the rustle of small animals moving through brush. When he finally sees the top of the sagging roof through the trees, he feels a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. The house seems to lean on itself, swallowed by vines and warped wood, yet it exudes a strange, oppressive presence, as though it has spent decades waiting for someone foolish enough to return. As he steps onto the overgrown path leading to the front porch, he notices signs that the house is not simply decaying, it has been altered. Carvings mark the doorframe, symbols etched by someone with trembling, desperate hands. Some of the lines overlap violently, as if the person carving them ran out of space but continued anyway, determined to leave a message somewhere, anywhere. Inside, the air is stale, thick with the kind of stillness that suggests the house has not been touched in many years. Dust hangs in the beams of dim light like suspended ash. The floorboards creak under his weight, each movement sounding magnified in the suffocating quiet. As he explores, he sees evidence of a life lived in confinement. Furniture is sparse and crudely repaired, as though the family had no access to the outside world. The kitchen still holds cracked jars filled with unidentifiable remains of food. A child's chair sits in the corner of the living room, facing a wall where deep scratch marks form chaotic spirals. In one of the upstairs rooms, he finds a small closet lined with tally marks, hundreds of them, scratched by fingernails into splintered wood. Some tallies are grouped into clusters, some are crossed out, some trail off into frantic, slashing lines. But the most unsettling discovery awaits him near the back of the house. A door, reinforced with old chains and multiple locks, stands at the end of a warped hallway. The metal is corroded but still intact, suggesting someone tried very hard to keep whatever lay behind it contained. As he approaches, the hair on his arms rises. The door emits a faint, hollow resonance, almost like breathing. He doesn't know whether it's his imagination or something more tangible, but the sound makes him step back instinctively. For the first time since beginning his investigation, he feels a surge of fear that tells him this place is not abandoned in the way he had hoped. It is holding memories, secrets, and perhaps something far worse, preserved in the dark for decades, waiting for the moment someone like him would return. Key point number 7 revolves around the discovery of the chained basement door, and expanding it reveals how the journalist begins to realize that the house is not simply a relic of the past but a container built to hold something that should never have been allowed to exist. After wandering through the upper rooms, each filled with remnants of confinement, desperation, and silent suffering, he feels an unshakable instinct pulling him toward the back of the house again. The locked door at the end of the hallway lingers in his thoughts like a cold hand pressed against his spine. Something about it feels different from the rest of the decay, as though the house itself was built around it, not the other way around. He approaches the door slowly, his footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. The chains wrapped around the hinges are thick and old, coated in rust that crumbles when touched, but their weight is undeniable. Someone wanted this door sealed, not merely closed. The multiple layers of locks, some mismatched as if added at different times, suggest a growing fear, someone responding to something inside that could not be fully contained. He crouches to examine the bottom gap between the door and the floor, noticing the wood beneath it has darkened unnaturally, as though it spent years absorbing something damp, something that seeped slowly outward. When he places his palm flat against the door, the wood is colder than the rest of the house, almost unnervingly so. For several seconds, he hears nothing but his own breath and the creak of the structure settling. Then, faintly, so faintly he wonders if he imagined it, he hears a tapping sound. Soft, irregular, hesitant. A pattern that feels almost purposeful. He jerks his hand away as if burned, his heart pounding hard enough to echo in his ears. He tries to rationalize it. Old pipes. The house shifting. An animal trapped beneath the floorboards. But deep down he knows the sound was none of those things. It had rhythm. It had intent. He steps back, instinct telling him to leave the house entirely, but fear and curiosity root him in place. His flashlight shakes slightly as he directs its beam across the door. That's when he notices faint markings above one of the locks, small scratches that look recent, not weathered like the rest of the carvings in the house. They resemble fingernail marks, dragged across the metal in tiny, desperate arcs. Whatever or whoever made them did so from the inside. The silence that follows is almost worse than the tapping. It presses against him, thick and watchful. He feels the unmistakable tension of being observed, as though something behind that door has noticed his presence and is waiting for him to make the next move. The house, which already felt oppressive, now feels aware. And he realizes that the warnings he received, warnings he brushed aside, weren't about the family's history alone. They were about this door, this room, this presence that has been sealed away for decades, not because it was forgotten, but because no one dared let it out. Key point number 8 centers on the discovery of old cassette tapes, and expanding it reveals how the journalist begins hearing the family's story in the father's own voice, a voice that should have died with the house but somehow survived within it. After backing away from the chained basement door, his pulse still thudding with the echo of the faint tapping, he forces himself to move through the rest of the house in hopes of grounding his nerves. In one of the side rooms, partially hidden beneath collapsed shelves and a mound of rotted books, he notices a small metal box. Its lid is dented, its hinges barely holding on, but inside he finds several cassette tapes, each unlabeled except for dates scrawled in uneven handwriting. Some are smudged, some nearly illegible, but they stretch across years, far too many years for any normal household to record without reason. He pockets the box and returns to his car, needing distance from the house before pressing play. Even in the open air, the property feels as if it's watching him leave, its broken windows glinting with a dull, haunted awareness. He drives to the edge of the forest, where the trees thin just enough for him to breathe again. There, he retrieves an old cassette player from his trunk, an item he carries for archival work, and inserts the first tape. The machine clicks, whirs, And then, after a moment of static, a voice emerges. It is unmistakably male. Calm. Measured. Too steady for someone living in isolation. The voice speaks in a tone that blends confidence with doctrine, as though delivering a sermon or a lecture meant to be memorized. He speaks about purity, about devotion, about loyalty to the family above all else. He describes the outside world as poisoned, filled with interference meant to weaken what he calls their line. His words drip with conviction, each sentence crafted with the manipulative confidence of someone who knows how to twist fear into obedience. As the tape continues, the journalist hears faint sounds in the background, children whispering, a woman crying softly, something scraping repeatedly against wood. The father's voice never wavers. He instructs his children on rituals of cleansing, though he never explains them clearly, speaking in coded language that suggests more than it reveals. At moments, he lowers his voice to a chilling whisper, instructing someone to keep them in the dark and remind them why they were chosen. The next tape is worse. The father speaks of preparations, of growth, of the necessity of maintaining the circle. His tone is affectionate when he addresses the children, but there is an undercurrent of possessiveness that makes the journalist's skin crawl. Then, midway through the recording, there is a sudden thud, followed by a shrill, muffled cry. The tape continues without interruption, as though such sounds were ordinary, expected, routine. With each cassette he plays, the journalist feels the boundaries between past and present collapsing. The father's voice is not a relic, it is a living testament of control, fear, and indoctrination. The tapes provide a direct line into the mind of the man who orchestrated generations of psychological imprisonment. And as the final tape ends with a long stretch of static, the journalist realizes something deeply unsettling. The dates suggest the recordings continued long after authorities claimed the family had disappeared. Someone stayed. Someone continued the cycle. And someone wanted these tapes to remain hidden until the right person came looking for them. Key point number 9 focuses on the discovery of a buried room containing the daughter's journals, and expanding it reveals the first truly intimate glimpse into the personal horrors experienced within the family. After listening to the tapes, the journalist becomes consumed with the need to understand not just the father's doctrine but the perspective of those who lived under it. Guided by faint floorboard markings and subtle indentations in the ground near the back of the house, he begins to suspect that the property may conceal more than crumbling walls and rotted furniture. One evening, armed with a shovel and flashlight, he uncovers a section of the backyard where the soil seems unnaturally compacted. After hours of careful digging, he exposes a wooden hatch, partially rotted but still intact, its edges engraved with small, frantic etchings that match the style he has seen throughout the house. The hatch opens with effort, revealing a narrow passage leading downward into a small subterranean room. The air inside is thick and musty, carrying the scent of earth and decay, but beneath it, the journalist senses something older, something deliberate, a preserved space untouched for decades. The room is just large enough for 1 or 2 people to stand or crouch, and against the far wall, he finds a pile of journals bound in cracked leather. Each one is tied with twine, the bindings worn but carefully preserved. He sets them aside carefully, recognizing the care taken in keeping them safe. Someone wanted their story preserved, even in hiding. Opening the first journal, he finds a detailed account written in a small, precise hand. The daughter describes the suffocating control exerted over every aspect of her life, the rules, the fear, the endless rituals her father imposed. She writes of the children, some her own siblings, some her own offspring, and how they were forced into obedience, often without understanding why. The words are raw but measured, betraying both terror and the clarity of a mind attempting to retain its identity under relentless psychological pressure. She chronicles her attempts to escape, small rebellions that were swiftly noticed and punished, and the overwhelming sense of futility in the face of the father's dominance. As the journalist reads on, he encounters passages describing the children who changed over time, their behavior altered by prolonged isolation and indoctrination. The daughter documents their confusion, their mimicry of the father's voice, and the ways in which they internalized the manipulative lessons designed to shape them into extensions of his will. Occasionally, the writing breaks off mid-sentence, words slashed out in sudden frustration or fear, leaving gaps filled only by the horror of what might have followed. He feels a growing sense of intimacy and dread with each page. These journals are not just records, they are lifelines, glimpses into the minds of those trapped within an incomprehensible web of control. And as he continues reading, it becomes clear that the family tree is more than a diagram, it is a living chronicle, and the daughter's voice, preserved in these journals, provides both the key to understanding the father's influence and a terrifying reminder that the effects of his control extended far beyond the walls of the house. Key point number 10 revolves around the realization that the family tree is still growing and that the patriarch's influence has not ended, and expanding it shows how the journalist begins to comprehend the terrifying persistence of the legacy he is uncovering. After discovering the buried room and reading the daughter's journals, the journalist steps back from the subterranean space with a mix of horror and grim fascination. Each journal entry, each tally mark, each faint scratch on the house walls paints a picture not of a family lost to time, but of a lineage maintained through control, manipulation, and isolation. The more he pieces together, the more he realizes that the patterns he sees, loops in the family tree, repeated behaviors, cryptic instructions in the father's tapes, are not remnants of the past, they are echoes of a system designed to perpetuate itself. Returning to the town after days in isolation at the property, he begins to question what survived. The locals, still tight-lipped and wary, hint at odd sightings and strange behaviors, suggesting that some members of the family may have integrated into nearby communities, invisible but present. Names surface in old-school records, hospital registries, and small newspaper mentions, children who should have grown up elsewhere, yet remain connected through a tangled web of legal name changes, adoptions, and untraceable movements. The journalist begins mapping connections, and the more he discovers, the clearer it becomes that the patriarch's bloodline was never truly broken. He notes peculiar consistencies in behavior, uncanny similarities in appearance and mannerisms among different branches of the family, and subtle evidence of indoctrination passed down like a coded inheritance. The realization hits him hardest when he re-examines the final cassette tapes alongside the daughter's journals. Instructions meant to guide behavior, lessons in obedience, and cryptic warnings continue beyond the father's physical presence. The house, the journals, the tapes all function as tools of control, and some of the children grew up taking those tools with them. The cycles of secrecy, fear, and manipulation were carried into the outside world, leaving traces of influence in unsuspecting communities. What once seemed like a closed chapter is in fact a living story, one that may extend far beyond the boundaries of the property, the town, and even the immediate family. The journalist begins to understand the stakes. Uncovering the family's history is not merely an academic pursuit or a moral imperative. It is a confrontation with a pattern of behavior and ideology that refuses to remain confined to the past. Every fact, every name, every clue he uncovers suggests that the patriarch's vision, the twisted preservation of his lineage, is ongoing, maintained through fear, obedience, and secrecy. And as he connects the dots between the abandoned house, the surviving family members, and the ripple effects in surrounding towns, he is forced to confront a terrifying possibility. The family tree he has been studying is not dead. It is still growing, still adapting, and somewhere, someone is continuing the work the father started decades ago, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next cycle to take root.